A sheer stone wall blots out the sun, built by hands without machines centuries ago. These were not just piles of rock, but complex survival machines. Today, you will discover the brilliant engineering that made Europe's castles and fortresses nearly unconquerable. We will reveal the hidden mechanics and strategic genius behind these monumental structures. How did a simple ditch become a psychological weapon, and what was the fatal flaw hidden within the strongest gatehouse? After this journey, you will look at every ancient stronghold and see the mind of a master engineer in its stones. What does true impenetrability really demand from human ingenuity? An army marches across an open field, its soldiers looking up at a fortress carved into the horizon. That sight alone was a weapon, a cold dread sinking into the stomach of every man. For the commanders inside those walls, the goal was starkly simple: survival against any force, no matter its size. This desperate need gave birth to a defensive philosophy not of brute strength, but of cunning leverage. Every stone was placed with a triple purpose: to deter an attack before it began, to delay the enemy's advance at every step, and to utterly demoralize those who persisted. Ancient military thinkers like Vegetius, whose works were studied for centuries, argued that the strength of an army lay as much in its fortified positions as in its soldiers. This wisdom was etched into the very landscape. A castle was not a single barrier but a series of traps. An attacker would not face one wall but several, each one forcing them into a more vulnerable and costly position than the last. Imagine being a knight, having survived a hail of arrows just to reach the outer wall, only to see another, even higher wall looming beyond it. Your momentary triumph turns to ash. The towering keep, the final refuge, was the ultimate psychological blow. It stood as a silent promise of a long and bloody fight, a symbol of unyielding control that could dominate the countryside for miles. The mere existence of such a fortress forced every army to reconsider its entire strategy, often avoiding a direct assault altogether. This was the foundation of fear, and it was only the beginning of the defender's advantage. That first line of defense began as a simple idea, a tall, unbroken barrier, but the wooden palisades of early forts splintered under fire and decayed in the rain. The true revolution came with stone, transforming a basic wall into the mighty curtain wall, a name derived from the Latin for court, the defended space it enclosed. This was not a single slab of rock. Its core was often a chaotic mix of rubble, gravel, and mortar, a flexible heart that could absorb the tremendous impact of a siege engine's blow. This core was then skinned with precisely cut and fitted dressed stone, creating a smooth, formidable face that was both stable and resilient. The sheer scale was a calculated defense in itself. Height soared to prevent siege ladders from reaching the top, while thicknesses could reach 20 feet or more, creating a depth that made battering rams seem like useless toys. But a long, flat wall has a fatal weakness: blind spots where attackers could gather safely. The solution was to reinforce it with towers, projecting outwards at regular intervals. A fortress like Crac des Chevaliers perfected this, its towers ensuring that every inch of the wall was visible from multiple angles. This created a deadly crossfire known as enfilading, where arrows and missiles could rake along the length of the wall, catching any attacker in a storm of projectiles from the side. The curtain wall was the canvas upon which the entire art of castle defense was painted, a masterpiece of engineering that forced enemies to confront an impossible task before they even reached the gate. But the most inviting path into the castle was also its most treacherous masterpiece of deception: the gatehouse stood as a monumental challenge, a statement that entry came at the ultimate price. It was never a simple door, but a deep, multi-layered fortress in its own right, engineered to be the strongest point in the entire defensive circuit. Its purpose was to transform the act of entering into a slow, methodical slaughter. Attackers were not welcomed, they were processed through a brutal sequence of traps. The journey began at the moat, where a wooden drawbridge could be withdrawn, physically severing the connection to the outside world and leaving any assault force stranded. Should an enemy manage to cross, they would face the first of several iron portcullises. These massive latticed grills, shod with spikes at the bottom, were housed in stone slots above the gateway. At a moment's notice, defenders could release the mechanism, sending the heavy gate crashing down to crush the first ranks of soldiers and seal the passage. Even if the first gate was breached, a second or even a third portcullis often waited deeper within the stone tunnel, creating a series of deadly checkpoints. And above it all, the ceiling itself came alive with murder holes. From these openings, defenders could rain down a horrifying assortment of projectiles, from arrows and heavy stones to boiling water or hot sand, which could seep through armor and cause unbearable pain. The entire passage was designed as a long, dark funnel, forcing soldiers to crowd together in a cramped space where they could barely raise their shields, completely exposed to attack from the front, the sides, and most terrifyingly from above. The magnificent gatehouse at Caernarfon Castle exemplifies this brutal efficiency, with its twin imposing towers and a series of 5 successive gates and portcullises. This was defense through overwhelming, concentrated force, making the one place an enemy had to go the very last place they would ever see. Yet even the mightiest gatehouse could be rendered useless if an enemy simply went under it. To counter this threat, defenders turned to the very earth itself, creating a barrier that was as much about perception as it was about physics. The moat was not merely a ditch, it was a masterful piece of hydrological engineering designed to isolate the fortress completely. While we often picture a serene, water-filled trench, these defenses came in 2 primary forms. The wet moat was a formidable aquatic obstacle, its depth and width carefully calculated. It was often fed by diverting a nearby river or tapping into natural springs, a process requiring immense labor and precise surveying to ensure a consistent water level. This liquid barrier served multiple brutal purposes. It kept heavy siege towers which had to be rolled right up to the wall at a frustrating distance. More importantly, it made the ancient art of mining, where attackers would tunnel under walls to collapse them, nearly impossible. Digging a stable tunnel is difficult enough, but doing so while constantly fighting a seepage of groundwater was a recipe for a catastrophic cave-in. The dry moat or fosse was just as cunning. Though it lacked water, its sides were cut into steep, slippery slopes, often reverted with timber or stone to prevent erosion. Crossing this ditch under a hail of arrows was a slow, exhausting, and deadly process, leaving soldiers completely exposed. The iconic moat surrounding Bodiam Castle in England demonstrates the psychological brilliance of this design. Its wide, still waters create a perfect mirror, reflecting the towering stone walls and making the entire structure appear twice as high and utterly unassailable from the ground. So how did a moat change the entire equation of a siege? It forced an attacker to solve a series of complex problems before a single ladder could even be placed. Every moment spent building bridges or rafts was another moment the defenders had to strengthen their position, and another day the besieging army's supplies dwindled. The moat turned a direct assault into a protracted, logistical nightmare. proving that sometimes the most powerful defense is simply creating enough space and time for an attacker to reconsider their entire plan. Even if the outer walls were breached, the fight was far from over. Rising from the heart of the bailey stood the keep, a final, almost arrogant statement of defiance. This was the donjon, a name derived from the Latin for lordship, and it was the castle's ultimate redoubt. More than just a tower, it was a self-contained fortress designed to sustain a garrison long after the rest of the castle had been overrun. Within its thick walls, you would find a deep, protected well, massive storerooms packed with salted meat and grain, and living quarters for the lord and his most trusted knights. It was a community in miniature, built to outlast starvation and despair. The earliest keeps were simple wooden structures, but their vulnerability to fire and decay led to a revolution in stone. The White Tower of London stands as a monumental example of this shift. Its sheer scale and solidity meant to dominate both the landscape and the minds of those who saw it. To build such a giant, engineers employed brilliant techniques. The walls at the base were not just thick, they were colossal, sometimes reaching 15 feet of solid masonry. These walls often tapered slightly as they rose, a subtle design that lowered the center of gravity and distributed the immense weight of the structure down into the earth, making it incredibly stable against both siege engines and the slow sink of time. Windows on the lower levels were few, narrow, and high off the ground, mere slits that allowed archers to fire out while presenting a minuscule target for anyone shooting in. The interior layout was a masterclass in defensive planning. The ground floor was typically a dark, vaulted storeroom, while the main living space and great hall were located on the upper floors. This meant that even if attackers broke through the main door, they would then face the grueling task of fighting their way up a narrow, twisting staircase, all while defenders rained down attacks from above. The legendary endurance of Rochester Castle's keep proves how effective this design truly was. It withstood a brutal siege by King John for months, only falling when the king's miners finally collapsed a corner of the tower by tunneling beneath it and using the fat of 40 pigs to fuel a fire that cracked the stone. The keep was the final, unbreakable knot in the defensive cordon, a symbol that the will to resist could be built, stone by stone, into a form that might last forever. But the ultimate expression of this defensive philosophy arrived with a devastatingly simple idea: a castle within a castle. This was the concentric design, a revolutionary leap forward that transformed a fortress from a barrier into a trap. Emerging from the brutal battlefields of the Crusades, this concept abandoned the idea of a single, mighty wall. Instead, it created multiple, independent rings of defense, one nestled inside the other. An enemy army that managed to storm the outer wall did not achieve victory. They merely entered the most dangerous place of all, a carefully engineered killing ground. Now they were trapped in a narrow, exposed belt of land, caught between the wall they had just scaled and a second, even higher and stronger inner wall looming before them. From every direction, death would rain down. The inner wall was deliberately built taller than the outer one, allowing defenders on its ramparts to fire over the heads of their comrades on the outer wall and directly into the trapped enemy force below. This created a terrifying, overlapping field of fire where every square foot of that outer ward was visible from multiple angles and vulnerable to arrows, stones, and bolts. This horrific space even earned a grimly descriptive name: the Death Zone. The masterpiece of this design is undoubtedly Beaumaris Castle in Wales. Built with near-perfect geometrical symmetry, its plan is a thing of brutal beauty. An attacker would face a daunting sequence of obstacles: a water-filled moat, then a strong outer wall studded with 16 towers, and finally the colossal inner wall with its own massive towers and gatehouses. The entire system was designed to function as a single, integrated machine of defense. Arrow loops in the inner wall were precisely angled to cover the entire death zone, meaning soldiers trapped between the walls had nowhere to hide. A direct assault on a concentric castle was not just difficult, it was nearly suicidal. This brilliant design fundamentally changed the nature of siege warfare, making lengthy blockades and complex starvation strategies the only viable option for an attacker. The concentric castle represented the absolute pinnacle of medieval military thought, an architecture of layered resilience where every breach simply led to a deadlier fight. An outer bailey might seem like a welcome relief after surviving the gatehouse, but this open ground was a carefully laid trap. It was a space designed not for living, but for killing. Every path, every building, every turn was a deliberate piece of a defensive puzzle meant to disorient and dismantle an attacking force. Imagine a group of soldiers bursting through the outer gate, their momentary triumph shattered as they find themselves not in a clear courtyard, but in a maze of narrow, winding lanes. They cannot see the inner gatehouse clearly, they cannot form a proper battle line. Instead, they are forced into a single file, squeezed between high stone walls. From those walls, defenders unleashed a constant hail of arrows and crossbow bolts. The attackers' shields, useful against a frontal assault, were now almost useless against fire coming from the sides and above. This was the brutal genius of the bailey's design. It turned the open space into a lethal funnel. Even the buildings within the bailey, like the blacksmith's forge or the stables, were not placed at random. They were often positioned to create sudden choke points or to block a direct line of sight and charge toward the inner defenses. An invader would have to navigate around these structures, slowing their advance and breaking their formation into smaller, more manageable groups that could be picked off one by one. This entire area was under constant surveillance from the inner wall and its towers, creating a killing field where every step was monitored and every movement could be met with a deadly response. The seemingly simple layout of a castle's interior was in fact a masterstroke of psychological and military engineering. It took the one advantage a large attacking force possessed, its numbers, and systematically stripped it away, leaving only confusion and vulnerability in its place. Every towering wall began not with a blueprint, but with a hammer strike against a mountainside. The very bones of these fortresses were hewn from the earth by quarrymen whose work was a feat of endurance and precision. Choosing the right stone was the first and most critical decision. Builders sought out hard, dense limestone or sandstone, materials that could resist not just centuries of rain and frost, but the brutal impact of a trebuchet stone projectile. Softer stone might be easier to cut, but it would crumble under the first serious assault, making durability the non-negotiable priority. At the quarry, the process of freeing these gigantic blocks was methodical and physically demanding. Workers would painstakingly chisel a series of holes in a line along the natural grain of the rock. Into these holes, they would insert two curved metal strips called feathers, and then drive a wedge between them. By systematically tapping each wedge in sequence, they created a controlled fracture that would eventually split a perfect block, weighing several tons from the living rock. But freeing the stone was only half the battle. How do you move a mountain one block at a time across miles of rugged countryside? The logistics were a nightmare solved with simple machines and immense human effort. For land transport, blocks were loaded onto massive wooden sledges and dragged over log roads, greased to reduce friction by teams of oxen. When a river or the sea was nearby, the stones were loaded onto flat-bottomed barges, a much more efficient method that could carry dozens of blocks in a single journey. The final transformation happened at the castle site, where rough-hewn stone met the mason's artistry. Using hammers and chisels, these skilled craftsmen would dress each block, carving its faces flat and square until it could fit against its neighbor with a gap often thinner than a knife blade. This precision was not for beauty but for strength. A wall built of perfectly fitted stones bound with mortar acts as a single monolithic unit, distributing weight and absorbing impact far more effectively than a pile of rubble. The colossal ruins of Chateau de Coucy still testify to this mastery, its remaining stonework so exact that the walls seem to have grown from the ground rather than being built by hand. The silent, immovable strength of the castle was born from this relentless physical science of stone. While the castle's walls stood defiant against the sky, a far more insidious war was being waged in the darkness below. The greatest threat to a fortress was often the one you could not see, the slow, patient work of the sapper. These specialized soldiers did not attack the walls, they attacked the very ground beneath them. Their goal was to dig a tunnel known as a mine directly under a critical section of the wall or a tower. At the end of this tunnel, they would hollow out a large chamber, support it with wooden props, and then set it all on fire. As the wooden beams burned away, the chamber would collapse, and with it, the massive weight of the stone above would come crashing down, creating a deadly breach. This was not a clash of armies, but a race against time, fought in stifling, pitch-black corridors of earth. How do you defend against an enemy you cannot see, whose only warning is the faint, muffled sound of a pickaxe deep underground? The answer lay in a defensive system as clever and covert as the attack itself, a network of countermines. These were tunnels dug outward from within the castle by the defenders, specifically designed to intercept the approaching enemy mines. Think of it as a subterranean spiderweb with the castle at its center, feeling for the vibrations of any fly caught in the dark. Detecting these underground assaults required constant, ingenious vigilance. Guards would place bowls of water on the stone floors of the castle's lower levels, watching the surface intently for the slightest ripple that would betray digging far below. In specially dug pits or against the foundation walls, soldiers with the sharpest hearing would press their ears to the ground or against a drumskin, listening for the distinctive chink, chink, chink of metal on stone. Once a mine's direction was pinpointed, the defenders would begin their own tunnel, aiming to smash directly into the enemy's passage. When these two tunnels met, the result was a new kind of warfare, a brutal, close-quarters battle fought by men wielding picks, hammers, and daggers in cramped, airless spaces where no banner could fly. If they could reach the enemy mine in time, defenders might simply collapse it, burying the sappers alive. If a water source was available, they might breach the tunnel wall and flood it, turning the earth into a tomb. The famous siege of Rochester Castle provides a stark lesson in the power of mining. After months of holding out, the Great Keep was finally breached when King John's sappers tunneled under a corner tower. They used the fat of 40 pigs to create an intense hot fire that cracked the massive stone foundations, bringing a whole section of the wall down. This unseen war of dirt and darkness proved that true defense had to extend deep into the earth, matching every hidden threat with an even more cunning form of protection. A castle builder did not simply choose an empty field. He was a master of terrain, reading the landscape like a military map, searching for the one spot where nature itself would fight alongside his stones. This was the high ground advantage, the ultimate force multiplier in an age of close combat. A fortress perched on a steep hill or a jagged outcrop commanded an unobstructed view for miles, turning its watchmen into human early warning systems. They could spot the dust cloud of an approaching army long before it arrived, giving the garrison precious days to prepare. But the true genius of elevation was in the brutal physics of the assault. Any soldier charging uphill would arrive at the base of the wall exhausted, his legs burning, his breath ragged. He would be forced to look up at defenders who were rested, well-positioned, and hurling death down upon him with the added power of gravity. This simple slope could have the effectiveness of an entire army, breaking their momentum before a single ladder was raised. Consider Edinburgh Castle, a breathtaking stronghold built upon the sheer, black rock of an extinct volcanic plug. Its foundations are the bones of the ancient earth, presenting a cliff face so formidable that in some places no man-made wall was even necessary. To assault it was to scale a mountain under fire. Then there is the sublime defensive artistry of Mont Saint-Michel, rising from the sea off the coast of Normandy. Here, the architect did not just use rock but the very ocean. Twice a day, the tide rushes in with astonishing speed, transforming the surrounding sand flats into a vast, impassable moat. Any besieging army would be forced to retreat or be drowned, their siege towers and camps washed away by the relentless sea. This was geographic warfare at its most brilliant, turning the predictable rhythms of nature into an impenetrable shield. Yet a fortress also had to live. A perfect defensive pinnacle was useless without a reliable source of fresh water. The most strategically sited castles always enclosed a deep, protected well or a natural spring, ensuring the garrison could survive a blockade that might last for months. The land was not just a barrier, it was a partner. It provided the foundation, the first line of defense, and the means of survival, asking only that the builder possess the vision to see its hidden strengths. A castle's stones were never silent. They were the stage for a brutal symphony of coordinated fire, where every weapon had its part to play in the defensive orchestra. The architecture itself was the first instrument, meticulously shaped to give the defenders every conceivable advantage. The iconic silhouette of the battlements, with their alternating high merlons and low crenels, was not just for show. It was a life-saving system of cover and fire. An archer could step into the open crenel to loose an arrow, then step back completely behind the solid merlon to be shielded while he knocked his next shot. This simple, brilliant rhythm turned the top of the wall into a protected firing line that could sustain a withering hail of arrows for hours. The weapons these archers wielded defined the tempo of the battle. The English longbow, a simple stave of yew wood, was a masterpiece of ballistic engineering. In the hands of a trained archer, it could unleash a storm of arrows with a rate of fire that could see a dozen shafts in the air before the first one hit its target. This created a suppressive rain of fire that could pin down entire units of advancing soldiers, but for raw, armor-piercing power, the crossbow was king. Its heavy, short bolt, launched by a mechanism of wood and sinew, could punch through chainmail and even some plate armor at frighteningly close ranges. While it was slow to reload, its great tactical value lay in its simplicity. Unlike the longbow, which required a lifetime of training to build the necessary strength and skill, a crossbow could be effectively operated by a soldier with only weeks of practice, allowing a garrison to field a powerful defensive force even with limited veteran fighters. As warfare evolved, so too did the castle's skin. The arrival of early gunpowder weapons like the hand cannon required new architectural adaptations. The narrow arrow loops designed for bows were useless for the bulky, fiery discharge of a gun. Builders responded by creating specialized gun loops, often a simple, round hole in the stone, sometimes with a wider internal splay that allowed the gunner to swivel his weapon and track a moving target while remaining almost entirely protected. But the most terrifying defensive feature for any soldier at the base of the wall was the machicolation. These were stone galleries projecting out from the top of the wall, supported by a series of corbels with openings in the floor. From this horrific perch, defenders could look straight down and rain destruction directly onto the heads of attackers below. Through these murderous openings, they would drop heavy stones to crush helmets and shatter bones, or pour cauldrons of boiling water, hot sand, or quicklime that could seep through armor and burn the skin. The concentric design of a castle like Beaumaris brought all these elements together into a single, terrifying system. Archers on the inner walls could fire over the outer walls, crossbowmen in the towers could rake the flanks of any assault, and gunners in their loops could cover the gatehouses. The structure did not just hold the weapons, it directed and multiplied their power, creating a seamless union of stone and steel that made every inch of the approach a calculated gamble with death. A castle's towering walls meant nothing if the people inside were dying of thirst. The most brilliant defensive design could be undone not by a battering ram, but by a contaminated water bucket. Securing a fresh, reliable water supply was the single most critical engineering challenge after the walls themselves, a hidden lifeline that determined whether a fortress could endure a siege of months or even years. This was a battle fought not on the ramparts but deep underground, where engineers orchestrated a hidden network of survival. The heart of this system was the well, a project of staggering ambition. Within the inner bailey, or most securely deep inside the keep's foundation, teams of miners would dig straight down, sometimes for more than 100 feet. This was back-breaking, dangerous work in near-total darkness with a constant threat of collapse. As they descended, they would line the shaft with stone to prevent cave-ins, creating a protected tube that reached all the way down to the water table. The well in the White Tower of London is a perfect example, plunging through the foundation to tap into a deep aquifer, ensuring that even if the outer courtyards fell, the last defenders in the keep would never go thirsty. But what if the water table was too deep or the rock too hard to penetrate? Ingenious builders had other solutions. They constructed elaborate systems of lead pipes or hollowed out wooden logs to channel water from distant springs on higher ground, a gravity-fed supply that could continuously replenish the castle's reserves. And throughout the courtyards, vast stone cisterns were built to capture every drop of rainwater from the roofs, a precious resource that could mean the difference between life and death during a dry summer siege. Yet bringing water in was only half the problem. A crowded fortress also had to get waste out or face death by disease. This is where the humble garderobe or latrine becomes a marvel of medieval sanitation. These small, private chambers were built directly into the outer walls, with stone seats positioned over chutes that plunged straight down. Waste would either drop directly into the moat below, a grim but effective deterrent for anyone considering a swim, or into a deep cesspit that was regularly cleaned out. This direct disposal system kept the living quarters clean and minimized the risk of cholera and dysentery, the invisible armies that could destroy a garrison more effectively than any sword. The true mark of a great castle was not just how it kept enemies out, but how it sustained life within. Its longevity was forged as much by the clean water in its well and the efficiency of its plumbing as by the strength of its battlements. So the next time you stand before a ruined fortress, look past the mighty walls and try to find the old well shaft, now often filled with silence. That dark, deep hole in the ground was once the beating heart of the entire defensive machine. The first castles were not monuments of stone, but swift assertions of power thrown up on conquered soil. In the wake of the Norman invasion of England, speed was everything. The solution was the motte and bailey, a design of brutal simplicity and immediate effect. Laborers would dig a deep, circular ditch, piling the earth high into a steep, flat-topped mound called the motte. On its summit, they erected a wooden tower, a watchtower and final stronghold. At the base of the mound lay the bailey, a large enclosed yard protected by its own wooden palisade and ditch, housing stables, workshops, and barracks. This entire fortress could be constructed in a matter of weeks using local timber and forced labor, allowing a handful of Norman knights to dominate a vast and hostile countryside. But for all its strategic genius, the Motte and Bailey had a fatal flaw. Wood burns, it rots, it splinters under a sustained assault. A determined enemy with fire arrows could reduce this symbol of control to a smoldering ruin in a single night. The race to survive sparked the first great leap in castle design, the shift from timber to stone. The transformation began not with the outer walls, but at the very heart of power, the keep. The earliest stone structures were simple shell keeps, where a thick, circular stone wall was built around the top of the existing moat, replacing the fragile wooden palisade. Inside this protective stone ring, the wooden buildings remained, now sheltered from fire and missiles. But this was only a partial solution. The true revolution came with the construction of the Great Stone Tower Keep, a solid, multi-storied building of immense strength that combined the functions of a fortress, a palace, and a storeroom. Colchester Castle stands as a monumental testament to this early ambition. Built on the foundations of a Roman temple, its colossal keep, one of the largest ever constructed in Europe, was a clear statement. The age of wood was over. This architectural arms race was fueled by the brutal lessons of war, particularly the Crusades. When European knights journeyed to the Holy Land, they encountered fortifications that dwarfed their own in scale and sophistication. They saw vast concentric walls, powerfully projecting towers, and intricately designed gatehouses that made their own square keeps seem primitive. They returned home with new ideas, a sharpened understanding of what was possible, and a deep-seated fear of the very siege tactics they had just employed. Every assault on a castle, successful or not, served as a live fire test, revealing weaknesses that the next generation of builders was determined to fix. A wall that was 10 feet thick might stop a battering ram, but it could be cracked by a determined mining operation. The response was to make the walls 15, then 20 feet thick, and to dig deeper, more vigilant countermines. Square towers, while imposing, had vulnerable blind spots at their corners where attackers could gather unseen. The solution was the rounded tower, which deflected siege engine shots and eliminated those deadly angles, allowing defenders to cover every approach. This relentless process of innovation, driven by the constant feedback loop of attack and defense, reached an early peak in fortresses like Caerphilly Castle in Wales. Here, the lessons of centuries were synthesized into a single, overwhelming defensive scheme. Caerphilly was not just a stone castle, it was a hydrological masterpiece surrounded by vast, artificial lakes that made a direct assault almost unthinkable. Its concentric walls, its formidable gatehouses, and its clever use of water represented the full flowering of the impenetrable ideal. The journey from the simple earthen mound of the Motte and Bailey to the sprawling stone complex of Caerphilly was not a slow, natural evolution. It was a desperate sprint, a story of how vulnerability forged resilience, and how each new threat was met with a stronger, smarter, and more formidable answer in stone. The strength of a castle was measured by the genius of its creator. Behind every soaring wall and impregnable gatehouse stood a single, pivotal figure, the master mason or military engineer. These men were the true architects of medieval power, possessing a deep, practical knowledge of geometry, physics, and materials that rivaled any scholar of their day. Yet history rarely recorded their names, consigning their brilliance to the silent testimony of the stones they left behind. They were far more than simple artisans. A master builder was the chief executive of the most complex construction project of the age, responsible for a staggering array of tasks. He had to manage hundreds of laborers, from unskilled diggers to highly specialized stone carvers. He orchestrated the entire logistical nightmare of sourcing and transporting stone, timber, and lead. And above all, he was the final authority on a design that had to balance immense defensive needs with the practicalities of daily life for a small community. His tools were not just the trowel and chisel, but detailed plans scratched onto plaster or parchment, and carefully crafted wooden models used to visualize the final structure and secure funding from his royal patron. We catch a rare glimpse of one such genius in the figure of Master James of St. George. This master mason was personally recruited by King Edward I of England to execute his iron ring of fortresses in Wales. James was not just a designer, he was a project manager on an epic scale, moving between construction sites at castles like Harlech, Conwy, and Beaumaris to oversee the work. His understanding of structural forces was intuitive and profound. He knew how to distribute the colossal weight of a wall through careful buttressing, how the thrust from a vaulted ceiling needed to be channeled safely into the ground, and precisely how to mix mortar for both strength and flexibility. This was not purely theoretical knowledge. It was a science forged through generations of trial and error, a blend of inherited tradition and relentless innovation. The master builder worked with an empirical understanding of his materials. He knew that a certain type of limestone became harder when exposed to air, or that a mortar mix with too much sand would crumble under the first impact of a trebuchet stone. His mind was a living library of stresses and strains, of hydrological principles for moats and wells, and of the ballistic angles needed for effective arrow loops. When a foundation settled unexpectedly or a quarry ran out of the best stone, he was the one who had to adapt the entire design on the fly. The enduring majesty of his creations, standing for centuries against war and weather, is the ultimate tribute to his skill. The castle was not just a pile of rocks, it was the physical manifestation of one man's intellect, a mind capable of envisioning a stone giant and then commanding the earth to give it form. A closer look at a finished wall reveals more than just stone. Etched into the surface of many blocks are strange, cryptic symbols, a forgotten alphabet left by the hands that built this fortress. These are the mason's marks, the personal signatures of the craftsmen who shaped each piece of the puzzle. Far from being idle graffiti, this was a highly organized system of medieval accounting. Since most stonemasons were illiterate, they each adopted a unique, simple geometric design, a symbol they could carve quickly and consistently. When a batch of finished stones was delivered to the master mason for inspection, he would tally up each unique mark. This record determined each man's pay, based directly on the quantity and quality of the stone he had produced. It was a brilliant, non-literate method of quality control that held every worker accountable for his contribution to the whole. But these marks tell a deeper story than just wages. By mapping their locations across a castle, archaeologists can trace the invisible lines of the construction site itself. A continuous stretch of wall bearing the same set of marks indicates a team or a gang working together on that section. A sudden shift in the symbols used reveals where one team's responsibility ended and another's began. This hidden ledger in stone allows us to understand the project's logistics, showing how the work was divided and organized for maximum efficiency. The evidence is not only in the carvings but in the stone itself. The specific chisel patterns left by different tools, the subtle variations in the color and composition of the mortar, these are all clues that help experts piece together the construction chronology. A sudden change in the type of stone used, or a distinct seam in the masonry, can indicate a pause in building, perhaps after a siege, or a new phase of expansion funded by a later lord. At the extraordinary project of Gaidelen in France, where a castle is being built from scratch using only 13th century methods, these ancient practices are no longer theoretical. The modern-day stonemasons there each choose their own mark, carving it into every block they dress. They work in designated teams, their collective marks slowly rising together on a single tower, physically demonstrating how these medieval work gangs operated. These tiny, unassuming scratches are a direct personal connection to the individuals whose names are lost to history. They are the fingerprints of the anonymous thousands whose skill and labor literally raised these giants from the earth, a silent testament to the human effort encoded in the fortress's very skin. The true price of an impenetrable fortress was not counted in stones, but in silver. To erect a single major castle was to launch an economic enterprise on a scale that could drain the treasury of a wealthy king, a monumental investment that demanded a river of coin flowing for years, even decades. Consider the sheer human cost alone. A project like Beaumaris Castle in Wales required a workforce of nearly 2,000 men during its peak building season. This was not a single crew, but a small, specialized city of laborers. Quarrymen wrestled stone from the earth. Carters and boatmen formed a continuous supply chain moving those stones to the site. Masons carved them with precision. Blacksmiths forged the thousands of nails and hinges, and carpenters built the intricate scaffolding and siege engines. Every one of these hands needed to be paid, fed, and housed. The master mason himself, the brilliant engineer behind the design, commanded a salary worthy of a high-ranking nobleman, a necessary expense to secure the genius required to turn a king's ambition into a stable, soaring reality. The cost of materials was equally staggering. Beyond the mountain of stone, there was the forest of timber needed for scaffolding, roofs, and the massive internal frameworks of floors. Then came the iron, a strategically vital and expensive commodity. A single, functioning portcullis required high-quality iron ore, smelted and worked by skilled smiths into the enormous lattice and chain mechanism. Every hinge on every great door, every metal brace, represented a significant outlay. How did a monarch like Edward I of England finance his iron ring of castles in Wales, a building campaign of almost unimaginable scope? The answer lies in ruthless financial engineering. He imposed heavy, unpopular taxes on his subjects, particularly on movable goods, and he secured enormous loans from banking families in Lombardy, effectively mortgaging the future of his kingdom to pay for its present security. This was not mere construction, it was a statement of absolute power. A lord who could summon the resources to build a castle was demonstrating a control over men, money, and materials that was itself a form of domination. The rising stone walls were a physical manifestation of his economic reach, a permanent and undeniable claim on the land and its people. To see a castle was to understand, instantly, the colossal wealth and unwavering ambition of the man who built it. Yet the principles of impenetrability were never a single, rigid formula. Across Europe, the castle adapted to its environment, becoming a cultural blueprint as much as a military one. In the windswept Scottish Highlands, the threat of sudden clan warfare gave rise to the stark, vertical defiance of the Tower House. This was a fortress in its most concentrated form, a tall, narrow stone keep where a chieftain and his immediate family could retreat, securing themselves and their most valuable goods on the upper floors while the ground level served as a byre for livestock. Every feature was a response to local need. The compact footprint minimized the number of men needed for its defense, while its great height provided a commanding view over the surrounding glens, a necessity in a landscape of surprise raids. Contrast this with the sprawling, romantic silhouette of a German hilltop castle like Berg Eltz. Nestled deep in a forested river valley, its architecture was shaped not by open plains, but by the confined, uneven terrain of a rocky spur. Its multiple towers and interconnected living halls were added over generations by different branches of the same family, creating an organic, almost chaotic profile that grew from the rock itself. The design was a product of inheritance laws and the need for multiple noble households to share a single, powerful stronghold. Far to the south, in the sun-baked heart of Spain, the architectural conversation was entirely different. Here, the Moorish occupation left an indelible mark. The Alcazar of Segovia, with its soaring, slender towers and ornate horseshoe arches, reveals a synthesis of Christian military might and Islamic artistic elegance. Its foundations are Roman, its form is medieval European, but its decorative soul is deeply Moorish, featuring intricate stucco work and serene courtyard gardens that speak of a culture that valued beauty alongside defense. Even the most basic building material, stone, was not always available. In the flat, marshy lowlands of the Netherlands and northern Germany, where good quarry stone was a rarity, builders turned to brick. Fired in massive, temporary kilns built near the construction site, these clay bricks produced fortresses with a distinct, bold aesthetic. The red brick castles of northern Europe, like Malbork Castle in Poland, required different engineering. Bricks are strong in compression but lack the monolithic strength of great stone blocks. This led to the development of immensely thick walls and broad, stable towers to distribute the weight effectively, creating a style that was both formidable and uniquely beautiful. From the Viking raids that shaped the sturdy, cylindrical keeps of Normandy to the merchant republics of Italy, where powerful families built compact, urban fortresses like the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence right inside the city walls, castle design was a fluid art. Each region took the universal language of defense and wrote its own distinctive dialect, proving that true strength lies in perfect adaptation. Centuries of rain, frost, and relentless wind have proven to be the ultimate, unending siege. While armies could be defeated, time is an enemy that never retreats. The simple fact that so many of these stone giants still claw at the sky is the most profound victory for their builders. This was not accidental. The longevity of these fortresses was engineered into them from the very first foundation stone, a deliberate war against decay waged with brilliant practical science. The silent hero in this story is often the humble mortar binding the stones. This was not simple mud or weak lime paste. Master masons developed sophisticated recipes, sometimes mixing in volcanic ash or crushed, fired bricks to create a primitive form of concrete that was both strong and slightly flexible. This flexible strength was vital, allowing the walls to shift and settle over the decades without cracking apart. A wall that was too rigid would shatter under its own weight or the heave of frost, but a wall with a little give could endure for 1,000 years. Just as important was the castle's ability to shed water. You can see the evidence of this in the intricate network of stone gutters carved into parapets and the lead downpipes channeling rainwater away from the walls. Constant moisture is the great destroyer of masonry, freezing in cracks and expanding, or seeping into the core of a wall to weaken its rubble heart. Every roof was angled, every courtyard sloped, and every surface designed to send water rushing into carefully planned drainage channels and cisterns. The foundation itself was a masterwork of foresight. Builders would dig down to stable bedrock, creating a wide, level platform that distributed the immense weight of the walls evenly and prevented the entire structure from listing or collapsing into soft ground. The choice of stone was a local decision, but always a strategic one. builders selected dense, hard-wearing limestone or sandstone from quarries they knew would resist weathering. Compare the enduring majesty of Conwy Castle in Wales, its stonework still sharply defined after 7 centuries, to the fate of countless Motte and Bailey castles. Those early wooden forts have vanished almost completely, leaving behind only faint grassy mounds where their proud towers once stood. Their ephemeral nature proves the revolutionary power of stone. Today, the battle continues at places like the magnificent city of Carcassonne in France, where teams of artisans work constantly to repoint mortar, clear block drains, and replace worn stones. Their work is a direct continuation of the original builder's intent, a fight against entropy that honors the medieval engineers who gave them such a formidable head start. Their survival is a silent, ongoing victory, a testament written in stone that the most brilliant engineering secrets are those that outlast not just kings and armies but time itself. A castle's greatest victory was often won without a single drop of blood being spilled. Its imposing silhouette against the sky was a carefully crafted message, a psychological gambit designed to erode an enemy's resolve long before the first siege engine was built. The towering keep was not just a refuge, it was a symbol of unyielding permanence. From a distance, its sheer verticality dominated the landscape, a constant, looming reminder of the Lord's power and the futility of rebellion. An approaching army would watch that stone giant grow larger with every step, a psychological weight pressing down on them. The sounds that emanated from within were equally calculated to intimidate. During a tense parley outside the gates, the sudden, grating roar of a portcullis being tested, the shriek of its iron spikes dragging against stone channels, was a deliberate auditory threat. It was a sound meant to echo in a soldier's mind, a preview of the moment the trap would be sprung and the only way forward would be sealed shut. For the commanding general, the psychological warfare was even more direct. The sight of supply wagons endlessly rolling into the castle's lower bailey, or the knowledge gleaned from spies that the granaries were full and the well was deep, could be enough to cancel an entire campaign. His army, living off the land with limited supplies, could not afford a siege lasting months, let alone a full year. The mere suggestion of such endurance, of a garrison content to wait while his own men grew hungry and restless, made the castle's walls seem twice as high. And then there was the unnerving complexity of the fortress itself, a maze of walls and towers visible from afar. An attacker could study it for days and still not understand its internal logic. Where were the death traps? Where would the killing zones be? This uncertainty, this fear of the unknown, was a weapon in itself. A commander had to ask himself if he was willing to lead his men into a stone labyrinth where every archway might hide a murder hole and every courtyard could become a slaughter pen. The ultimate goal of this architectural intimidation was to make the cost of assault seem unacceptably high, to turn a potential victory into a certain nightmare. The castle stood as a cold, rational argument against aggression, proving that the most impenetrable defense is often the one that exists in the mind of the enemy. The thunder of gunpowder did not shatter the principles of defense, it simply reshaped them. The high, proud walls of the medieval castle, so effective against ladders and rams, became colossal targets for the new siege cannons. A cannonball striking a flat stone surface could shatter it into deadly shrapnel, while a direct hit on a tall tower might bring the entire structure crashing down. The castle's greatest strength, its vertical dominance, had become its greatest weakness. The response from military engineers was swift and radical. They abandoned the sky and embraced the earth, creating a new form of fortress known as the Trace Italian, or the Star Fort. Its design was a masterpiece of geometry over grandeur. The new walls were low, thick, and sloped, built from packed earth faced with brick, a material far more effective at absorbing the kinetic energy of a cannonball than rigid stone. But the most revolutionary feature was the bastion. These were angular, arrowhead-shaped projections that extended out from the corners of the fortress. Their genius was twofold. First, their angled surfaces were designed to deflect incoming rounds, much like a modern armored vehicle uses sloped armor. Second, and more importantly, they eliminated the deadly blind spots that had plagued square and round towers. The placement of bastions was mathematically precise, ensuring that every inch of the fortress wall and the ground directly in front of it could be covered by defensive fire from the bastions on either side. This was the familiar concept of enfilading fire, perfected centuries earlier in castles like Crac des Chevaliers, now re-engineered for the age of artillery. The entire fortress, when viewed from above, resembled a many-pointed star, a form that allowed it to present a bristling, defensible front in every direction. This was not an abandonment of medieval ideas, but their logical evolution. The concentric castle's layered walls and death zones were translated into the Star Fort's complex network of outer ramparts, ditches, and ravelins, smaller defensive works placed in front of the main walls to disrupt and channel an attacking force. The goal remained the same, to create a sequence of lethal obstacles that would grind an army down before it could reach the heart of the defense. The French military engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban later refined this star-shaped model to an incredible degree, creating fortification systems so effective that to attack one was considered a military folly. His designs were the direct descendants of the master masons who built Beaumaris, proving that the core philosophy of layered, resilient defense was timeless. And this legacy did not end with the age of black powder. Look at any modern military forward operating base. You will see a defended perimeter, often with raised guard towers offering clear fields of view and fire. You will see layered security checkpoints that funnel visitors through controlled access points, echoing the deadly sequence of a medieval gatehouse. The principles of defense in depth, of channeling an enemy into predetermined killing zones, and of creating a self-sufficient stronghold are all concepts that were forged in the fire and stone of the Middle Ages. The castle's stone bones may have crumbled, but its defensive DNA was encoded into the very blueprint of modern warfare, a permanent monument to the medieval quest for an unbreachable sanctuary. Hidden foundations and erased earthworks are now whispering their secrets to the sky. Archaeologists are deploying a new kind of magic, a suite of non-invasive technologies that allow them to see through soil and stone without ever breaking the ground. One of the most powerful of these tools is LiDAR, or light detection and ranging. Mounted on aircraft, it fires millions of laser pulses toward the ground. These pulses pierce dense forest canopies, mapping the minute variations in the Earth's surface with astonishing precision. The result is a ghostly, three-dimensional map of the terrain, stripping away the modern forest to reveal what human eyes haven't seen for centuries. The faint, circular imprint of a long-rotted motte, the straight lines of a filled-in ditch, the sprawling outline of a lost outer bailey, all suddenly become clear. This is how we discover that a solitary castle tower in a field was once the heart of a much larger, more complex fortress, its full defensive plan erased by time and plows but now resurrected in digital light. But what about the secrets buried deep beneath the courtyard? For that, researchers turn to ground-penetrating radar. This device sends radio waves into the earth, listening for the echoes that bounce back from buried structures. A solid stone foundation reflects a different signal than the loose soil around it. A hidden cistern or a collapsed tunnel appears as a distinct void in the data. It is like giving the earth an X-ray, revealing the castle's hidden anatomy, its circulatory system of water pipes and its skeletal foundations, all from the surface. This technological revelation does not stop with discovery. The data fuels breathtakingly accurate digital reconstructions. Using 3D modeling software, historians and engineers can now rebuild a castle stone by virtual stone, restoring its fallen towers and reconstructing its great halls. They can then step inside these virtual worlds, testing long-held theories with empirical proof. What were the exact sight lines from the northwest tower? Could an archer on the inner wall truly see the base of the outer wall? With a click, they can place a virtual archer on the rampart and see the world through his eyes, confirming the brilliant geometry of the death zone. This digital archaeology is more than just a visual spectacle. It allows us to stress test the castle's design, simulating the path of siege engine projectiles or analyzing the structural load of a wall. Each simulation deepens our respect for the master masons, proving that their intuitive understanding of physics and geometry was often as sophisticated as our own computer-assisted calculations. The stones have held their secrets for 1,000 years, but now, through the silent conversation of lasers and radar waves, they are finally beginning to speak. A sentry's footsteps echo on the cold stone of the wall walk as the sun first touches the battlements. This fortress was never silent, never truly at rest. Its heartbeat was the daily rhythm of the garrison, a community of perhaps 50 or 100 souls whose entire existence was dedicated to keeping the machine oiled and ready. The sheer walls and deep moats were only as strong as the people who maintained them, and every single day was a rehearsal for the siege that might come tomorrow. At dawn, the watch changed, with rested men taking their positions on the towers, their eyes scanning the horizon not from a casual glance, but with a practiced understanding of the landscape, noting any movement, any strange dust cloud, any flicker of distant fire. Below them, the castle courtyard erupted into a controlled chaos of purpose. The blacksmith's hammer began its relentless ring, not forging new swords, but more often repairing the mundane tools of defense, sharpening the spikes on a portcullis or mending a link in a soldier's chainmail. The castle's brilliant layout made this efficiency possible. The barracks for the common soldiers were always situated right against the inner wall, allowing the garrison to spill out from their sleep and onto the defensive ramparts in minutes. The stables were positioned near the gatehouse for a swift cavalry response, while the massive storerooms were deep within the inner bailey, their doors thick and their locks strong, protecting the castle's lifeblood of grain, salted meat, and dried beans from both enemy action and petty theft. And at the center of it all, both socially and practically, was the well. This was not just a source of water, it was a meeting point, a place for gossip, a quiet moment of reflection. The constant drawing of water for cooking, for cleaning, for the horses, and for the great cisterns used to fight fires, created a daily pilgrimage to this deep, dark shaft. The castle's design funneled this daily life along paths that reinforced its security, proving that the engineering genius was not just in withstanding a catastrophic assault, but in enabling a community to thrive under the constant, low-grade pressure of watchfulness, turning routine itself into a form of defense. A stone fortress could starve 1,000 men long before its walls ever cracked. The real battle of a siege was not just fought at the ramparts, but in the hearts and stomachs of the people trapped inside. Master engineers knew that despair was a weapon as potent as any battering ram, so they designed these strongholds to be more than just defensive shells. They built them to be instruments of psychological resilience. Deep within the keep, vast storerooms were carved from the cool earth. These were not simple pantries, but meticulously planned larders. Their thick stone walls and vaulted ceilings maintained a constant, cool temperature, perfect for preserving enormous stocks of grain, salted meat, dried fish, and legumes. A castle like Dover in England could hold enough supplies to feed a garrison of several hundred men for many months, turning a blockade into a grueling war of attrition that the attackers outside, living in muddy tents and foraging for food, were often the first to lose. But full bellies alone could not sustain hope. The Great Hall was the fortress's beating heart. During a siege, this vast space transformed from a place of feasting into a vital communal sanctuary. Here, the entire garrison would gather, sharing meals and news, reinforcing the social bonds that kept discipline from fraying. The lord presiding over these gatherings was not just eating, he was performing a crucial act of leadership, projecting an image of calm control and confidence that was contagious. For the noble family, the ability to retreat to private chambers, however simple, offered a crucial escape from the relentless pressure and public gaze, a small island of normalcy in a sea of fear. Even spiritual needs were engineered into the stone. A castle's chapel provided profound solace, a place for prayer, and the comforting rhythms of ritual that reminded defenders they were not abandoned, that a higher power watched over their struggle. The architects even considered the very air they breathed. Narrow windows and ventilation shafts, often overlooked as mere architectural details, were deliberately placed to create cross breezes, flushing out the stagnant, disease-ridden air that could cripple a garrison faster than any sword. Light was equally vital. Where possible, inner courtyards were designed to capture sunlight, and window placements maximized the daily illumination of living spaces, fighting back the oppressive gloom of confinement. A castle that could keep its defenders physically healthy and mentally anchored was a system working in perfect harmony. It turned a potential prison into an enduring home, proving that the strongest fortress was one that fortified the human spirit as well as the horizon. The parchment dreams of medieval engineers sometimes outpaced the quarries and treasuries of their kings. Tucked away in forgotten manuscripts and workshop scrolls were designs for fortresses so ambitious they were never built, blueprints for an impenetrability that remained purely theoretical. One visionary plan, attributed to an anonymous master mason, proposed a castle with not 2, but 4 concentric rings of walls. Each successive wall was to be taller and thicker than the last, creating a dizzying series of death zones that would have required an attacking army to capture and hold each level in a grueling, multi-stage battle. The logistical reality of such a project, however, was its undoing. The sheer volume of stone needed would have bankrupted a kingdom, and the construction time would have stretched across the lifetimes of the original architect's grandchildren. Another design explored a gatehouse that was less an entrance and more a vertical labyrinth. It featured spiraling ramps that forced any attacker to make 3 full circuits under constant fire from overhead machicolations before even reaching the first portcullis. While brilliantly cruel, contemporary military strategists likely dismissed it as over-engineered. A standard gatehouse with 2 portcullises and a murder hole tunnel was already devastatingly effective. Why invest in a Rube Goldberg machine of death when a simpler, proven design would do? Modern engineers have now brought these paper dreams to life using structural simulation software. They can model how a theoretical tower with a unique starburst-shaped base would have deflected trebuchet shots more effectively than a standard round tower. They can also run virtual sieges, discovering that while the quadruple-walled castle would have been nearly impossible to take by direct assault, it would have been uniquely vulnerable to starvation. Its own colossal garrison would have consumed its vast food stores at an unsustainable rate, making it a prison of its own design. These unbuilt castles were not failures, but the purest expressions of a relentless creative drive. They show that the quest for the perfect defense was a living, evolving conversation, one where the boundaries of stone and mind were constantly tested, even if only on parchment.